Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our second of 5 sessions on the question of forgiveness in a time of duress. Yesterday, as we began our program, it was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945. The world leaders from various nations and the few Auschwitz survivors that still remain with us gathered. In honor of that, I told the story of Simon Wiesenthal in a concentration camp being taken to a German soldier. And the German soldier, as he lay dying, literally asked Simon Wiesenthal, a Jew, to forgive him. And Mr. Wiesenthal left in silence and never really resolved the question, but he wrote a book called The Sunflower that opened up the scope of forgiveness by asking theological leaders, spiritual leaders, political leaders, philosophers to comment on whether they would have forgiven the German and the atrocities that he committed. I want to broaden our notion of forgiveness today within the context of the Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination. You know, we often think here's this young Jewish man in a concentration camp. He's taken to a German hospital. He meets a German soldier. The German soldier says, "Will you forgive me?" We tend to think about forgiveness in a limited scope. But what we know about ontology, physics, metaphysics is that it's all interconnected. And I want to connect that one event of Simon Wiesenthal's in the following way, in the spirit of the Socratic notion of truth pursued rather than truth possessed. Because the more I understand in my limited way about the power of forgiveness, the less I think I know about its efficacy and its parameters. We can even, starting with the Germans. The Germans were Hitler's willing executioners, as that book title suggested. And oftentimes we say that that soldier was following orders. It was Hitler. And maybe the whole German race was involved in some way. Was Simon Wiesenthal expected to also forgive, in addition to the soldier, the Fuhrer, the German people? It was President Roosevelt and Churchill that denied boats filled with Jewish refugees and sent them back to Europe, knowing about the Holocaust. Were some of the Jews that Roosevelt sent back, were they in the concentration camp? Should Simon Wiesenthal forgive Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin? The Germans weren't responsible for anti-Semitism. That had been incubating in the European mind for 2,000 years, initiated by the Christians. Should Simon Wiesenthal have been expected to forgive the Christian religion, Western civilization? And finally, Benjamin Netanyahu was in Poland yesterday. The Poles announced in advance they wouldn't arrest him for crimes against humanity. In the charges that have been brought against him by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, adjudicating whether he and Israel is guilty of genocide. And one of the supreme ironies of history, the genocide conducted by the Germans against the Jews finds a reciprocity right now, as the Israelis, according to the International Criminal Court and virtually every commentator in the world outside of the United States and a few European nations, consider what the Israelis have been doing to be genocide. What's the connection between this genocide and that genocide? There's been speculation, which we could go into, about the relationship. Should Simon Wiesenthal, in addition to considering forgiving Karl Seidel, the German soldier, forgiving the Fuhrer, forgiving the German people, forgiving Roosevelt, Churchill, that denied passage to the Jews, knowing what they knew, Western civilization that had given rise to anti-Semitism because of the Christian impulse. Should he then finally have been asked to forgive Israel for its genocide against the Palestinians? So when one takes in the reality of dependent origination, as the Buddha called it, but in modern physics, the entanglement of every proton and atom and molecule and life form with everything else that exists, the boundaries of forgiveness become gossamer. And in the end is what we are expected to do, simply to forgive everything that is, including ourselves, for what it is that we have been wounded by. Just questions to ponder in this time of assault on our morality, and a time when it seems as if iniquity is on the throne and truth and justice and empathy are on the gallows. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Humanity Rising for this very deep and profound exploration of forgiveness in our time. I want to now turn it over to my good friend, Tom Eddington, who is the convener of our week. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And once again, thank you for your opening comments. And I want to pick up on a couple of things you were just speaking to. And I'll start with dependent origination and then move from there into truth pursued. As we explore this, how do we bridge? And one of the challenges I've found personally over the last 6 or 8 months as I've been in contact with family members and colleagues is their seeming unwillingness to pursue truth and their starting point, their originating point around what they believe and why they believe it. And I found it especially challenging with our media and what our media is putting out in the world, resulting in people believing things that just aren't true. This morning, I had an exchange with a dear friend about Heather Cox Richardson's post today about the exchange between the president of Colombia and President Bush, or President Trump rather, over the weekend. And the story that's being spun out of the White House is factually inaccurate. And Heather Cox Richardson today did a beautiful job of explaining the history and the implications of the exchange between the presidents over the weekend. And the spin that's being put out there it's a lie. And yet millions of Americans and others around the world are consuming that information and believing what's coming out of the White House to be true. And it's enhancing, it's increasing the divide. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation today to explore how do we bridge the divide. And I want to welcome my good friend and co-moderator this week, Eileen Barker, into the conversation. Welcome, Eileen.
Hi, thank you, Tom. Really appreciate your remarks and Jim's. And I'm reminded of, as you say that, just something I think Fred Luskin helped with yesterday, which is seeing both sides of it, and that we can see I can see very clearly because I am more oriented. I'm not less and less by the day, but I have traditionally been more oriented towards the left. I can see the lies on the right. It's harder to see the lies on the left, and there's plenty of those too. And I am moving I don't know if it's even center or just sort of away from the whole thing, but there's just so much spin on both sides. And so we really don't even know what the truth is. I mean, sometimes they're talking about something we do know, and we can see that really clearly, but we don't know what we don't know, we can't see. And I do really think that it's largely because the what we call news itself has become so polarized, politicized, and commercialized, and the need for really neutral news and trustworthy sources is huge right now, just huge. And so and we really don't have that to a large degree. So we pick our content and the things that really do speak to us. So I think we have to avoid what Fred talked about, sort of a tribalism, our own tribalism. And I know, like, for me, it's one of the people that I'm close to that sees things very differently as a sister of mine, one of my sisters. And it wasn't under Trump. For me, it started with Bush, and Bush W. I think it was W. And I just remember saying to her, look, you're my sister, and our relationship is more important to me than all of this. And I'm pretty interested and I care about what's going on in the world, but I said I'm not willing to let that come between us. And I've just that was my truth. That's the truth I found inside, that I wasn't going to pay that price. And I'm grateful for that choice. We just didn't talk about politics for maybe 10 years, and then we started to about 5 years ago. And it's really hard to talk about, but inevitably in those conversations, we find something we both agree on. And a lot we don't, but we find that middle ground. And so that's what she and I talk about. If there were only really a real middle, I think that would be really wonderful in the United States, to have a real middle. And a lot of people pretend to be that, but aren't. But anyway, that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I've shared it before on programs, but I'm not affiliated with a political party. My tribe is all sentient beings on planet Earth, and I try and speak from that place. And I suspect that sometimes people are hearing it, wanting to put me in a category, wanting to put me in a political affiliation or political party, and I've had to remind family and friends and colleagues over and over again that I'm not speaking as a Democrat or not speaking as a Republican. I'm speaking as a human being.
Beautiful.
And I think that's where I find a lot of this really challenging, is the choice people are making about, putting their tribe, their political affiliation ahead of the interest of all sentient beings on the planet. And it's very challenging, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Christy and Ken today to help me figure out how do I bridge the divides that exist, and how do I communicate, and how do I connect with people that I genuinely care about. I've had to remind family and friends over and over again that I love them, I care about them, and that the position I'm coming from is coming from a place of love. It's coming from a place of caring. But I won't accept positions that are being taken that harm others, and the cruelty, and the self-interest. That's a line that I'm really challenged by.
Okay, I hear that. Yeah. Let's bring in Christy Heacock, also known as Chris. I met Chris. I was going to say a number. I don't know if it's the right number, but it was during the pandemic. I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago. And she sent me a copy of her. It wasn't a copy of her book. It was a sort of the manuscript to review. And I was really sick at the time, and I just kept apologizing to her. Like months would go by. I'm so sorry, so sorry. I haven't been able to get. And then finally, I did. But it was almost a year later, and I was really blown away by this book. And I want to show it to you now. It's a beautiful book. It's called "Being Human is Hard." First of all, love that title, because ain't that the truth? Being human is hard. Choose forgiveness. It is hard. Choose forgiveness. So I love that. And then the subtitle, The Power of Connections, Courage, Compassion, and Creativity. So she wrote this book. She's going to talk to us about it. But, how strongly I feel about Fred's book, Forgive for Good. And this book challenged me because I thought, wow, it's hard for me to now say that's the go-to book, because this one is really important. So I definitely put it on I have a short recommended reading list, and this is on it, definitely. It's just written through stories of, I believe, 13 people that she interviewed and worked with while she was writing this. So, Chris, do you want to join us now? It'd be nice to bring you in. There you go.
Sure. Hi.
Yeah, yeah. Chris wrote this book. She works a lot in her life with she's an educator, a healer through an educator of forgiveness, and so Chris, tell us more about your journey with forgiveness in this book.
Sure. Forgiveness was important in my life. I had, my dad had wonderful qualities, but he also had some anger problems and that type of thing. And learning to forgive and deal with that was helpful. And the reason I ended up with the book is because I decided I wanted to pursue my doctorate, and I wanted to pursue it in psychology, but mix spirituality with it, spirituality and psychology. And I needed to narrow down the topic, and I decided forgiveness, because forgiveness is something that is so important to everyone. All the world religions stress forgiveness. You think about, if you're Christian, you think about the Lord's Prayer right after, give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who forgive us, forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So it was a huge topic, I thought. And then I knew as an educator that stories are important. And so I was able to interview people from different sacred belief systems, of a wide variety. I had, besides Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Shri Baba, which is kind of a Shri Baba, Hindu, Baha'i, agnostic. And then also, I'm from South Dakota and was lucky to be able to interview a couple of people who are Lakota, one who practiced Christianity and one who was a pipe carrier, and she was amazing. And so I interviewed them, and their stories are in the book. And then I looked at what they had in common, and what they all had in common, all these different ages and genders and sacred belief systems, was that they all had connections for support and guidance. They didn't try to do it on their own. And then they all had courage. Either what I found, which was really interesting, was sometimes it was the courage to listen to others and conquer their pride. Other times it was the courage to not hide, because they had shame, and to be able to forgive themselves and move forward and not have shame. So that courage to be able to either move forward because you felt shame, or the courage because you had so much pride, and it's kind of like you were talking about. We don't want to be wrong. I've asked sometimes students, would you rather have the truth, or would you rather be right, correct? And it's funny, they'll say, oh, I'd rather be right. I'd rather be correct. And that's a problem when when we want to have good conversations, when we want to have good civil discourse. We often believe what we want to believe because it's important to our identity, or it's important to us to be right, or we don't want to be embarrassed. So anyway, courage. And then, of course, compassion. And, um, Jim was talking about just human history, and my goodness, the human condition, and how do we have empathy for each other when we've done, we've all done things we regret, that type of thing. We talk about the Holocaust a lot, but think about it, we don't like to talk about slavery as much. And that was absolutely horrible. We don't like to talk about how Manifest Destiny, what that did to the Native Americans. It's just hard. It's easy to have compassion sometimes for others, but it's harder to take responsibility sometimes, or to look ourselves in the face and be able to um, have compassion for other people that maybe we feel responsible for hurting. And then creativity was the last C, because it's like, with Eileen's 12 steps to forgiveness. You have an old story that's not working for you. You're not having good relationships. You don't have inner peace. You feel stuck in a rut, and you need to create that new story. And the people that I interviewed then were able to take that hurt, that anger, and turn it into lessons learned and ways to move forward. But you have to create that. And creativity isn't like that. I mean, creativity takes effort. And that's another reason why civil discourse and forgiveness can be hard, because it takes that effort to create a more positive story that's empathetic, that's compassionate, and that will move you forward. So that hopefully you don't repeat those horrible things in the past, which, as Jim was talking about, we have, and I'll just go into a little psychology here, we have mirror neurons, and we learn a lot through observation. And the sad thing is, it's good to realize that, because we tend to just go ahead and do the same horrible things that were done to us to others. And we do it just kind of automatically, sometimes without even thinking. And we really have to upshift our thinking to get away from that. And of course, it can be on a global level with politics, where you see bad governments replacing more bad governments because people just do the same thing over and over again. Or you can think about abuse case like child abuse. And sometimes, some of the statistics say about half of the people, if they were abused as children, will just go ahead and do the same thing, even though they didn't like it, right? But we're such observational learners. We have these mirror neurons where you know, you're me, no, you're me, no, and we just go back and forth sometimes. But a lot of people don't abuse and are sure that they will not abuse again. And those are the ones that create that new story, that learn from it, that upshift their thinking. I kind of think of it that way. We've got our reptilian brains that keep us often at an instinctual level where we just do things automatically, fight or flight, that type of thing. But we have to get rid of that fear response, and we have to put forth effort to go ahead and upshift our thinking so we don't repeat those things that we really don't like, but we're repeating them. And I think the example of Israel is a good one. It's we sometimes just have such trouble seeing it in ourselves because of that.
Beautiful. So, Chris, thank you so much for kind of elaborating on that and showing that piece to us. That's so beautifully reflected in your book. Can you talk a little bit more about the work you've done with civil discourse? So that's like one of the big issues this week we want to get into is, I mean, what we're going to be talking about sort of the political arena, and we have been, but also the personal one. How do we talk to people that really just see it so differently? Or as Tom was saying, they just don't, they believe the lies. And it just sometimes brings up so much anger, outrage, and fear underneath, fear and it's very, very strong feelings about it. And perhaps, as you're saying, perhaps that is somewhat reptilian. I don't know, but there is a survival instinct too, because people feel very threatened. Certainly, for some people, their being is threatened. Their sort of humanity, their right to exist, deep.
Yeah.
So I know that you work with civil discourse. So I thought maybe starting just to give us a sense of that kind of work you do, and then we'll get into more specifics, perhaps.
Chris, before you respond to that question, if you wouldn't mind, if you could just repeat the 4 C's again for our audience.
Yeah. Connections. Everyone I interviewed had connections. They didn't try to do it on their own. They had support and they had guidance. It could have been spiritual. It could have been friends, therapists. Some were lucky enough to have a combination of that, but they all had some kind of connections that helped them feel supported and served as role models. And then the courage either to overcome shame or the courage to overcome pride and be able to face whatever it was without denial and willingness to give up the victim role. I mean, a lot of things that have happened to us we don't deserve. They're awful. Kind of like I was saying, you never say that a certain behavior is okay, not the behavior, but having the courage to go ahead then and move forward and face whatever it is without denying it. Let's say, oh, well, I don't want to. I don't want to stir things up, so it's okay that that person said these awful things to me, that type of thing. The courage to speak up, but then the C of compassion to do it with compassion. So courage, compassion, and then creating the new story. Courage, compassion, and creativity.
And Chris, you were saying, I mean, earlier, I think before we started, about how you really distinguish between forgiving the person, not the behavior.
And I think that is really important in civil discourse, is separating ideas from the person. And And that's difficult to do. But the forgiveness, you don't forgive bad behaviors and you set boundaries. Or if you want civil discourse, it's so important to set some boundaries yourself as to what's okay and what's not okay. As teachers, sometimes they talk about how hard cooperative learning is. And it's very hard because it's instinctually, we're out for ourselves and we don't necessarily behave well. And again, it's a matter of kind of upshifting our thinking so that we're thinking more in terms of how we can listen to others. We can think more in terms of win-win instead of win-lose. You've maybe heard that. I think sometimes when the way our system is now is we forget that it's not a matter of winning or losing or which side is better than another side. That's why, Tom, I agree with you. I try never to use labels if I can. And I recommend against it because kind of maybe diverging here, but meaning is in people. It's not in words. When I first heard that meaning is in people, not in words, I didn't quite understand it. But I certainly do now, because think about maybe your definition of what a liberal is, and people on a different political spectrum, what their definition of a liberal is. What's a Christian? Okay, is it a judgmental hypocrite, or is a Christian a generous, kind person? So I've really worked not to use labels and not to think in terms of win-lose or who's going to win an argument. And maybe I'll just give the example, like, I think things have gotten a lot more divisive. But when I married my husband, we have been married over 40 years, he's Republican and I'm a Democrat. Again, I try not to use labels. But it's, I've been a Democrat all my life and I stay that way because in South Dakota, there's not many of us. So I just figure we need a few just to even things up, right? But I really appreciated he was in business and finance, economics major. I learned so much about business. He learned about, I've always been in community service and education. And I felt like we both learned so much from each other. And the whole purpose, really, of different perspectives is so that we can come together and we can listen and we can come to a solution that's good for all the stakeholders, not shareholders, but stakeholders, everybody that's involved. So that can be hard, though, if we have this win-lose thing going on. And again, I'll tie that to psychology again. We have what's called a binary instinct. It's easier to have things in one category or another. It's good or bad, us versus them. And again, this is something it's just good to understand about ourselves. And that can work okay. It's kind of a shortcut. It's why we have stereotypes and it can be a shortcut, but it's really not good for civil discourse. It's not good to use labels because, again, meaning is in people and people interpret those in different ways. And and a lot of those words, especially the words that are just inflammatory, be it communism, socialism, fascism, those things just whoosh, bring people bring the reptilian brain out, I'll say. Reptilian brain is what psychologists just call our survival instincts, which are good. We need them to survive. But when it comes to civil discourse, they work against us. So we have to upshift. And you can even imagine a brain. We have the bottom layers that are our limbic system. And then we have our cerebral cortex, which helps us reason and think. And so if we can calm down, keep the fear down, and upshift our thinking to our cerebral cortex, we can get rid of some of the labels, maybe get rid of some of the binary win-lose thing, and think more about, gosh, they know something, I know something, let's put all this together and see if we can find a wonderful solution to this. So thinking in terms of what each side can bring instead of the win-lose. And again, we're fighting human instincts, which is why civil discourse is hard, because it's fun to win, right? It's fun to be right. It's fun to win. It's fun to be right. So that's where, and I think you're having a speaker on humility. Humility is a wonderful thing because humility gives us the power to say, okay, it's okay if I'm wrong sometimes. I'd really rather hear the truth. I'd really rather listen to some different perspectives. I'd really rather be curious than judgmental. So there's a number of those things. Then, if you really want some good civil discourse, like in a group, if you're planning it, it's really good to lay down and talk about how to do it because it's not going to come natural because of our instincts and the way our brains are, because of the human condition, you might call it. But it's certainly possible. We just need to work on it. We need to put the effort into understanding why we're fearful. Rumi's got a great little story about a little poem about, let those feelings in, figure them out, but then, understand them and then calm down so that you can actually use your cerebral cortex, so you can use your reasoning abilities in that way. And then it's kind of like you were talking about earlier too. That's, takes effort, but it also takes effort to be compassionate. Because if I want to really empathize, if I really want to be kind, I know there's people that really make me mad, right? We all have really make me angry. And it's work for me to remember that, we are all related. We are all part of a whole, and to really have that compassion for those people that we don't appreciate. And I'll use some of the examples of the people I interviewed for my forgiveness because they were people who could do civil discourse. And one of the ladies stressed because she had family members driving her crazy. We're all on our own paths. And being able to say, I don't like where you're at, but I know you're on your own path. And I want to have compassion for wherever you're at. And I can't change you, but I want to respect you. And that's a huge thing too for civil discourse, because who wants to have civil discourse if the person isn't respecting you, if they're taking away your dignity? I mean, it's pretty much impossible. If you're in that, you need to find a way to create that respectful environment or to set your boundaries. I love what you said, Eileen, about with your sister. And I've done that before too. You just, I'm not going to let those mean, nasty people, and this is my pipe carrier, the Lakota woman said, I'm not going to let them make me hate. No one's going to make me hate. And I think about that sometimes. No one's going to make me hate. It was like, and she had gone through, besides being Native American and all that they've gone through, her pregnant sister was murdered, as well as her mother. And forgiving someone who'd murdered your mother and your pregnant sister, and just being able to say, she said, no one's going to make me hate. And I just pray that they someday find their paths. And they're the ones that are, I'd hate to be them. And being able to do that. So having that compassion. My Muslim man who was he was from a different country where he was tortured and treated horribly. He's watched his best friend die because of the actions of the person. Again, he said, I'm not letting that hatred get to me. I and he could see how really tormented his torturer was. And he said, I don't want that. I don't want to be that person. And was able to see more about saving his own soul and being a person of integrity and not wanting those mirror neurons to work and try to get revenge and do the same rotten thing to somebody else as they've done to you. And it took compassion, and that took effort, because my Muslim man really stressed it. He said, this is really hard. There's a part of me that just doesn't want to do this. But he said, I know that I don't want to be eaten up like that. I don't want to be that person. but it is so hard.
Yeah.
So compassion can be very hard, but it can be very, very worth it
You
in
know, it
that way.
reminds me, I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh that said that he could, who also was imprisoned and tortured, and he said, I could forgive them for the torture, but I would never be able to forgive them for making me close my heart and hate them, something to that effect. And it's exactly what you just shared about the man, that was so the most important thing. And I think that's just so powerful and inspiring. It reminds me of, I'm listening to a book called, I think it's called Oneness by Rasha. It might be one, but I think it's Oneness. And at the very beginning, she talks about how important it is. And I think of this in terms of chakras for people who work with energy centers, which I think a lot of people on here do. But that the lower centers are about survival. They are the centers of fear, pain, anger, separation, and competition. The win-lose, like you're saying, those are the lower centers. And that is where I think our sort of collective consciousness, certainly in the US, has sort of been centered. Um, Ram Dass used to talk a lot about that. You know, we're in the second chakra and the third, I would say, with all the power issues. But what Rosh is saying is make it your work to stay in the upper centers, which is heart, love, compassion, just what you're saying. And then ultimately oneness, because forgiveness isn't the end result. Somebody pointed this out yesterday in the after chat. It's a means for me too. It's like sort of a means to an end, because the end point is oneness consciousness. It's love. It's being in the pure field, vibrational field of love, and having that higher consciousness, which I think a lot of what we're seeing in the public forum is lower consciousness. I mean, come on, it's obvious, right? It's lower consciousness. And yes, a lot of people are sort of caught up in that because maybe of the mirror neurons, but it's sort of contagious. And we know that is when we might be having a wonderful moment, but somebody comes with lower energy, and then it's easy to get pulled into that. Before we know it, we're at odds, or then we wake up again and bring ourselves back to our heart and our higher consciousness, and having compassion for them instead of feeling threatened by them. It's huge work. It's huge work to do. I believe that this is. I mean, here's how I feel. I feel that it's possible, as Fred talked about yesterday, planet Earth, interesting place, hard place. People come here at all different levels of consciousness. Everyone's on their path. Everyone is on their path, right where they're meant to be, including people that we don't understand or dislike or hate. But it's possible. I mean, some of us, I know I am on a spiritual path to raise my conscious awareness as much as I can. And I think a lot of people here, a lot of people are on that path, millions, but not a voting majority, obviously. But still, let that not pull me off my path. Just like Thich Nhat Hanh, you can he's literally being tortured. You can do that to my body, but you're not going to get inside my heart. That's what Viktor Frankl's saying. They could take everything from you, but your last freedom is your choice of your attitude. So I think this is a moment of great spiritual challenge, and an opportunity too to to rise, to use this to rise. So Chris, I just love how you've brought that in. I really appreciate it. And it is so. I'm curious, with civil discourse, are you working with groups? Are you working with two people? How do you usually do that work?
Well, I've done the presentations and have worked when I was coordinating the civil discourse project, working with teachers on different things like that. And now I just do presentations with the Humanities Council. But I think we're all always doing civil discourse work. Like I've been the chair of several boards, and if you've ever been on a board, you know that civil discourse sometimes is tricky there too. But it's the same um, things that, it'll be fun to hear Ken too, talk about it on a huge level, but also talk about it on a smaller level. And one of the things that I think is really important and helps is to keep focused on the mission, what you have, what your goal is. And sometimes we call it, don't get out in the weeds, where you're involving people's egos. Because sometimes that's what happens. You get off course. And so it's really important to bring yourself back to whatever the goal is. What are we trying to accomplish? And we could bring it into, I've heard political arguments, or trying to again get a board back on track to, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? But you can get off track again when you start using labels, when people's dignity, don't feel respected. Those things get us off course, and we really need to bring it back to our goals and what we have in mind. Another thing that's really helpful with civil discourse is to try to get rid of judgment and focus on curiosity. So when you find yourself judging, I mean, we all judge, and there's nothing wrong with that because we need to. But if you're in a group and you're trying to have civil discourse, um, that's that's a time to be curious, and ask, try to seek understanding. And that can really, really be helpful. Like asking instead of, oh my gosh, they think that way. We got to do something about that. They should not be thinking that way. More of a curiosity, and an understanding. Why do you think that way? And fear is a huge thing. If we feel disrespected, if there's something threatening, that somehow we feel threatening, we got to figure out what that fear is, calm it down if we want to move forward and have a good solution, because fear it isn't very helpful to our thinking. It's helpful in the short term, like, okay, run away, or get your hands off that hot oven, or whatever. But for good civil discourse, if people are feeling fearful or disrespected, it's going to be really, really, really tough. So when I work with a group, again, more, do a presentation, but when I've worked with boards and had the problem or whatever, what I found one of the most helpful things is to seek understanding, keep focused on the goal, don't let people get off in the weeds, and egos have too big of a part in the conversation then. And again, that takes some work, because when you find yourself judging and you're in a group, you have to switch modes to curiosity. Or we were talking about blame yesterday. One of the little phrases I love is fix the problem, not the blame. So if people are getting off on blame, and again, you need to know why something happened. But if people are getting off on blame, kind of like an end in itself, it's good to remember you're trying to fix the problem, not the blame. The blame is just helping you understand what happened so you can fix the problem, or so you can go ahead with what you need to accomplish. So again, there's little things that you can catch yourself with. If you find yourself judging, try to just be curious. If you find yourself blaming, think, okay, but we need to focus on fixing the problem or whatever is going wrong. So there's little tricks that we can do to help us keep on course, and to keep the civil discourse, as well as the component that you talked about, no one's gonna, that I was telling you that my Lakota lady really stressed, the pipe carrier, no one's gonna make me hate. Okay, I'm not. And the thing is, people sense that, right? So if hate and bad feelings are getting the best of you, it's it's going to be really hard to hide that. Your disdain, those types of things. But if people feel the disdain or if they feel they're not being respected, they're going to go into defensive mode. And the really rotten thing about that is they're going to dig in even deeper. So you may say something that you think, well, I'm going to put them in their place, or I'm going to tell them. What you've maybe done is just had them entrench even further into that whole viewpoint that you don't like, because, hey, you've challenged them, and they can't. I mean, when our identities are challenged, when our dignity is challenged. Um, we're not going to get into our rational brains. We're just going to defend, and we can dig in even deeper. So you really have to be careful of that so it doesn't backfire um, on you.
Chris, picking up on what you've shared, I love the curiosity, not judgment piece. I became a huge Ted Lasso fan last year, and one of the episodes is about curiosity, not being judgmental. And Ted is in a pub playing darts with somebody, and he goes into a whole conversation as he's about to beat his competitor in darts about curiosity versus being judgmental. I probably sent that 4-minute clip to 100 people or more, just to engage in a conversation. And I love that, what you've shared with our audience. I also appreciate your talking about the shadow side of ego, but something I brought into the conversation yesterday, I'm wondering if you could speak to, is I referenced yesterday Terrence Real and others who've done research on each of us embody our wounded child, our adaptive child, and our wise adult. And when you're encountering someone who is operating from their adaptive child, how do you bring them into their wise adult? So much of the behavior that I've witnessed from the president, the vice president, Elon Musk, and others, they're like 8-year-old boys. And what they're saying, it's outrageous behavior that you would expect from an 8-year-old boy, but not from an adult. And I'm wondering, when you encounter that kind of behavior, how do you create an environment? How do you create an invitation to bring an adult back into their adult?
Mm-hmm. And the sad thing is we can't control other people, isn't it? But we can influence them, and we can keep our own dignity. You don't want, I feel like, if someone's being that way, it's important to stay calm, which is very difficult. But trying to remember that that's going to be your best bet is to stay calm is a good idea. It's also, I think, very important for our own dignity to speak up, but to speak up in such a way that we don't damage our own self-respect. So speaking up to that, truth to power, as it's called, or whatever, I think is really important, because I think people can, if no one does, they think everybody agrees with them. And it can also, I think, speak louder when you stay calm, but still speak up. They're more likely, I think, to hear and to not get into their defensive, I'm going to beat you mode, which certainly will happen if you go back at them the same way, because a lot of people like that just love a fight, right? I mean, they think it is wonderful when they can exchange insults and try to best you with nasty remarks. So you're just giving them a real big treat when you do that. one of the things that's hard, and I'm not going to say it couldn't backfire on you, you always have to protect yourself. I'm a big fan of saying always set boundaries, protect yourself, feel safe. But there's also something powerful about being vulnerable. And the best way, like when you're in a situation where someone is like that, is often to share a story of maybe something that happened, and not demand that someone be persuaded, but not to be afraid to tell a story, not to be afraid to say how you're feeling, um, and see if you can bring out some of their humanity, because you gotta, like I say, it's a game to them, and they want to win. And so you gotta try to change the rules on them, and try to switch it around. Um, Asking questions, and also stating, again, you don't want regrets. So you don't want to feel like you you were a coward or something. But if you do it with a way that preserves your dignity, you speak up, but you do it with a way that preserves your own dignity, and that maybe if you're lucky, can help change the game that they're playing. So it can be more of a win-win, and a understanding thing.
Yeah, I love that. I think also, sort of one of the strategies I've been using is it's a little bit disengaging from it. I don't want to play your game. I don't want to, be in that conversation. And
Mhm.
but by the way, I love that Ted, the whole series, and that scene, Tom, of Ted Lasso. I just love it. I go back to the dart scene time and time again. It's just so clever and wonderful. Well, look who's here. Our dear friend
Oh.
Ken Cloke.
Hi.
I
Hi,
thought,
Eileen.
who's that coming in here? Oh, it's wonderful to see you. And Ken, I haven't
Yeah,
asked you yet, but how have you been impacted by the fires? You're right there in the middle of it. I see you're still there in your library, but yeah,
yeah, we survived.
yes.
My brother's house did not.
Mm,
He and his wife lost everything, and it's been a very traumatic experience for them.
of course.
Yeah. So, and others as well. Uh,
Are
so
you,
it's,
yeah. I'm just wondering because you're right in the middle, in a sense.
yeah,
Are you getting a lot of smoke and all of that?
yeah,
It,
it was snowing ash. I mean, it was like a snowstorm, but it was all just ash. Uh, it was bizarre. Um, and then the air quality was pretty bad for a while.
okay.
So, but
Well,
we're
yeah.
recovering. We just had a wonderful meeting in downtown Los Angeles with mostly in Watts and Compton, with people extending, sort of support to people who'd lost their homes, and talking about recovery, and uh, also thinking about political recovery and people who've been disappointed by the election. And it was very, very nice.
Well, that's what we're going to talk about with you today. That's what we're talking about. But
Okay.
let me just
And
give a little
what,
introduction, if you don't mind. Yeah, you have a
sure.
question? Yeah. Um, so Ken Cloke to me needs no introduction, but I realize that's probably not true for everybody listening. But Ken Cloke is many, many things, among them an incredible mediator and teacher. He's a lawyer. He's played all kinds of roles. I mean, about every role you could think of in the legal system. And you know, one of Ken's books it's called Mediating Dangerously, that I read about 25 years ago, really was life-changing and career-changing. After reading that book, and then I had the good fortune to meet Ken, and I just sort of, my life took a turn. And I want to talk about his new book, his latest book, I should say, and he's written many, could be about 20 now, I don't know, maybe
20.
20, The Magic of Mediation. And he talked about it last time he was here in September, and I have since, you know, gotten the book and been looking at it. This book is an incredible book, even if you're not a mediator, because every chapter it's about economics, it's about war, it's about colonialism, it's about life and all of the facets and all of the hardest things. And each of these chapters could be a whole book. Each of these chapters could be, I mean, I made a career out of like a few pages of a book that Ken wrote, because he packs so much in and he's so brilliant. So I really highly recommend this book for everybody who is just interested in understanding life. He says a search for symmetries, metaphors, and scale-free practices. And but luckily for us, his real, you know, I suppose heart of his expertise is in conflict, difficult conversations, and how to engage them in a way that's going to really shift the conversation and open and be heartful. And Ken, the question that's really up for us this week, of course, is, you know, after the election, it's so polarized, and it's just getting so polarized. And unfortunately, it's on both sides. And and as people are saying, it's not even sides anymore, but I do tend to think in that binary way, right and left, and they're both doing the same thing and catastrophizing and exaggerating and spinning. And then we get into our family life where people aren't talking to each other, aren't able to, because of the political divisions and the outrage that people feel because dear ones see the world so differently, and it's so painful sometimes to realize that. So we're laying that at your feet today for any guidance that you would like to share with us. How are you, you know, seeing the situation that we're in?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the kind comments you've made about my book and various books. And thank you for just thinking about how we can think together about the difficulties that we're in. And I think one of the keys to approaching this time that we are moving into is exactly what you said, which is the binary way of thinking. So just as an illustration, the federal government has now in the United States military and various other areas pushed out the idea of LGBTQ diversity. And one of the difficulties is that Trump has signed an executive order saying that there are two genders, male and female. So I'd actually like to start with a personal description of how this impacts us. About 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer. And so I had to undergo various types of radiation and medications that completely suppressed all of my testosterone. So I lived for a little over 2 years with no testosterone whatsoever. And my dominant hormone, gender-based hormone, was estrogen. And this created a number of changes in my life, changes in my body, changes in the way I thought and felt, changes in my perception of gender and kind of how it impacts us. And then gradually I stopped taking those medications and my testosterone began to come back. So going from a place of 0 testosterone to then a little bit more and a little bit more allowed me to experience gender differently every day. And I was speaking about this to my daughter, who is a physician, and she said, from a medical point of view, nobody is identical to anybody else in terms of the balance of gender and what gender means to them in their life. Everybody is unique. So the difficulty with creating a binary definition, really, of anything, is that life isn't so simple. It's vastly more complicated. And what your gender feels like at 8 a.m. may be different from what it feels like at 8 p.m. And that doesn't just extend to gender, it extends to a whole series of other things. So the problem becomes, how do we deal with the various changes that are taking place around us and create out of those changes some alternatives for a better future. And here I think is where we come up with a couple of things that are important. If we think not just about gender, but let's think now for a moment about some of the difficult areas of within politics, some of the controversial areas. For example, let's take sexual harassment as an illustration. So we know that sexual harassment is wrong. We know that neither women nor men should be subjected to it. But our approach to it is also binary. That is, there is sexual harassment or there isn't sexual harassment. But again, life is more complicated than that. So let me just ask a question for anybody. Have you ever had an experience of being sexually attracted to someone that was 55% yes and 45% no? Or worse than that, or more complicated than that, 45% yes, 20% maybe, and then another, 25%, well, it depends. And then all of this is shifting from moment to moment. So you're eager and excited and interested one moment, and then something happens, or you think of something, or you start to not feel so good, or whatever may happen. I mean, tens of thousands of things can happen that cause that dynamic to shift. So the difficulty is, it's exactly the same thing with regard to the truth in every conflict. Who's right and who's wrong? And it's exactly the same in every political case. That is, politics, when it's reduced to a binary equation, becomes a question of yes or no, this candidate or that candidate, this party or that party. And there is nothing in between. And what happens then is that we have created out of politics, which, if we think about it, is just a method of social problem solving. we have created out of it a way of resolving conflicts and solving problems that is way too simple when compared to the simplicity or complexity of the problem. So if the problem is simple, there's no difficulty. You can approach it in this way. But if the problem is complex, what will happen predictably if you take a complex problem and you try to resolve it simplistically? And the answer is you won't be able to. You'll pretend that you have a successful answer, but then you get caught up in the pretense, and then you have to force people into supporting the idea that your answer is correct. And so what happens is that a structure, a political structure emerges, a political system emerges in which there is a contest for whose truth is going to be the truth. And in the law, we have a mechanism for resolving this, which is that you appeal to a judge, and the judge will decide whose truth is the truth and whose is not. But I can tell you as a judge, in most cases, that's at least mildly inaccurate, if not grossly inaccurate. And there is something true about what everyone is saying, even if it's only an emotional truth, even if it's only a personal experience, even if it's only an angle of perception on what is taking place. So I know this is a little more than maybe you wanted me to say, but the fundamental idea then is this: the entire universe consists fundamentally, in the first place, of diversity. So there is positive charge in electricity, and there's negative charge, and there's neutrality. And in space, there is here, and there's there, and there's in between. So notice that there are at least 3 things that are created rather than 2, but that in between, that's actually most of everything is in between. And so what we can see is that we have been looking at the problem either from a one-dimensional perspective, which is my approach is the correct one, which is just one-dimensional. You only need one piece of information to know what the answer is, which is, what does the boss think? What does the dictator think? What does dad want? Whatever it may happen to be. And so that's a one-dimensional approach, and all of the solutions can be organized along a line hierarchically. And then a second approach is the legal approach, which is to say, no, it's two-dimensional. It's binary. It's the plaintiff or the defendant. And there is nothing in between. And then there is the third approach, which is the mediative approach, which is to say, nearly everything is in between. And it's really an exception that you would find a pure truth that encompasses everything and doesn't require any nuance. Let's take another political issue, abortion. I don't think there has ever been a woman who had an abortion for whom there was not some small struggle inside of herself over whether to do this or not. In other words, there were 2 truths. One was the truth of, I need to go forward with this, and the other is, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. And then the question becomes, how do you create a choice out of not only those 2 things, but everything in between? And the answer always is, it's a dialogue, it's a struggle, it's a negotiation, it's a relationship between parts of the truth that now are engaged with one another. And the same goes for being a parent. There are times when you have just had it as a parent and you can't take it anymore. And the same goes for virtually everything in life. So what we require is at least a three-dimensional approach to problem solving. But what the brain actually does in problem solving, and this has been demonstrated in neurophysiology and various CT scans that have been done, especially in Switzerland, where this work has really been advanced. And what they've demonstrated using algebraic topology and other methodologies and from mathematics is that the brain solves problems in at least 10 or 11 dimensions. But if you reduce those to one, what you will get is ongoing conflict, ongoing problems that cannot be solved. And then the question becomes, what do you do with a problem that can't be solved? And the easy answer is you blame someone else for that problem. And that's what we are experiencing now, and what we are going to be experiencing increasingly going forward until it begins to fall apart. So think of it this way. There are two fundamental forces, the force of diversity and the force of unity. Within a family, the force of individuation and the force of integration. And sometimes there's too much individuation and not enough integration, in which case everybody goes off on their own and there's no family. And sometimes there's too much integration and not enough individuation, in which there's just conformity and obedience. And again, there's no family. So what is family? Family is what is in between. Family is what is created by the day-to-day clash between individuation and integration, between unity and diversity. And so there are periods in history when we have had too much diversity and not enough unity. And there are periods in which there has been too much unity and not enough diversity. And these have gone back and forth. But what we've missed is that immense territory that lies in between those sort of seemingly polarized opposites. So here's the way that I come to this. There is no single correct answer for everyone at all times, under all circumstances, no matter what the question is. And the whole point in life is to discover one's own answers. And we do that by kind of bouncing off of each other, sometimes in conflictual ways, sometimes in loving and intimate ways, sometimes just by sort of watching and seeing what takes place. So there is the difficulty is that once we have embarked on this idea of there being a single correct answer, and I think that is what we have embarked on politically, and that answer is now being imposed on people who fundamentally don't agree with it. And then the question is, what happens when that takes place? And we can see with Colombia, just 2 days ago, what happens. You get forced to back down. You get bullied into being silent. And this leads directly and immediately to what we call fascism or dictatorship or autocracy. But it is the antithesis of democracy. So the political difficulty is, from a mediative perspective, how do we handle these disagreements? And here I think there is an answer. And this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it back over to you. The answer comes from Roger Fisher and William Ury in a book called Getting to Yes. And here is what they say. And this is the key to, I think, the whole of political rethinking. Separate the person from the problem. Be soft on the person and hard on the problem. So if you are soft on the problem, you have not been forgiving, you have been condoning. You are condoning what has happened. And if you are hard on the person, then you become unforgiving and inhumane and cruel and unkind. And so the goal of it is to do two opposite things simultaneously. And that is not an easy thing for people to do. It means accepting ambiguity and contradiction. It means accepting paradox. But if we ask the question, how do you solve a problem that's a paradox? If you come up with a single correct answer to any paradox, you've lost it. You've missed the whole point of the paradox, which is to lead you to a deeper truth. But that deeper truth is complex. It's not simple. And now if we just go to Umberto Eco, who wrote The Name of the Rose and a whole series of different books, Foucault's Pendulum, etc. He was a semiologist. And he was, as a teenager, a resistance fighter against Mussolini. So he actually was a part of the resistance to Mussolini and to fascism in Italy. And he wrote an article about the nature of fascism. And in it, he defined fascism this way. He said, fascism is, in quotes, the simplification of language to the point that complex thought becomes impossible. And I like that definition. But we live in a complex world. Who's complex? Everybody on the outside. Everybody who isn't you. Everybody who's a little bit different. Women are complex. African Americans are complex. Gays and lesbians are complex. And what happens to complex people in totalitarian regimes? They get eliminated. And why? Because we don't have the skills to be able to handle complexity. And I think that's the key thing. And that's where conflict resolution comes in. It is a methodology of combining diversity and unity, individuation and integration. That's what it is. Because you get to be you, entirely, completely, 100% you. And now we get to talk. And between you and me, we create an us. So that's my kind of basic idea about it. And I'm hoping that that is helpful. There's a lot more that could be said, but I think that that's really the essence of it. We have to figure out how to create conversations that include all of us, because none of the problems we face on the planet can be solved without it.
Thank you for that. I was reminded listening to you and what you were sharing last Thursday. Jody Evans was with us from Code Pink.
Oh, yeah.
And she was talking about what she's witnessing in Venice and the whole LA area with the fires and the community coming together and the conversations that people are having. And I referenced a colleague of mine who's created the U.S. Chamber of Connection in Seattle to bring people together. And it feels like there's something in the consciousness that's starting to emerge, that people are recognizing, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, of the need for community, the need to come together. in the presence of this seemingly intractable divide. And I'm wondering if you've been witnessing that, if you've been seeing that sense emerging of people wanting to come together in community. And
Yes,
Chris, if you
absolutely. Well, my brother's house burned down, and of course, he and his wife were devastated by this. But he said the thing that has buoyed them, has kept them afloat, is the kindness of strangers, to quote Tennessee Williams. And this fundamental capacity for kindness, I think, is a part of the human condition. We are all capable of it, just as we are capable of immense cruelty. And now the question becomes, why do we do each? And what happens when we become kind is that we have exercised our capacity for empathy and connection. We have recognized that we are one. We have overcome all of our differences. And seen that it is necessary to stand together against a common foe. But when that common foe retreats, we return back to allowing small differences to divide us. What Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small differences. And I think that's kind of what it is. So what needs to happen? And I think what needs to happen is we need to help people acquire higher order skills in order to have higher order relationships. So I think for me, what has happened in all of the relationships that I have been in, the intimate, personal, loving relationships that I have been in, is that I was able to create a relationship at one level, and that worked for a period of time. And then it became necessary for me to figure out, how do I get to a higher level, create a better relationship? And sometimes I was able to do that, and sometimes I was not. But when I wasn't, it was because I hadn't really understood what skills were necessary for me to acquire in order to do this. So we know what some of those skills are. Skills in emotional intelligence. Those are a set of skills that we require not only in terms of individual relationships, but politically as well. And these emerge in the face of catastrophe. Because catastrophe is the end of narcissism. You just can't sustain this magical thinking any longer about yourself or about your life. And this is part also of, I think, what I will call the gift of discovering your mortality. And that was something that I went through in the experience of prostate cancer. And it is something that I've gone through in various other periods of my life. But every time I got to a deeper understanding of the fragility of life, it led to an openness, a kind of increased sensitivity to parts of myself that I had simply paid no attention to. And I think that there is an analogy that we can see, for example, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in every place where there is warfare. And what happens in those areas is similar to what happens in workplaces and sometimes in families, which is that we create a lower order unity. That is a unity based on our differences with someone else, a unity against others. So Ukrainians have been united by the attack by Russia. Israelis have been united. Palestinians have been united. But they've been united because they faced the fire that we're facing in Los Angeles, but identified it with the other side. They've seen the threat as them. So it becomes an us versus them problem. But here's the deal. There is no them. There's only us. We're making it up. And making it up allows us to create an us, but it's an inferior us. It's a tiny little us. And it could be a way larger one, as we discover in those moments. 9/11 was another of those moments when people came together in that way. The entire country came together in that moment. How did that happen? What were the mechanisms? Can we figure out how to bottle that? And I think in mediation, we have done some of that work. We've figured out some of the ways of bottling it, and that's part of what the book is about, the magic in mediation. It's about how we actually draw people who hate each other into dialogue and communication and negotiation. In other words, into higher order relationships with one another. So thank you for that, Tom. That's a very good question, and I hope that was an answer.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. I want to bring Jim back in, but Eileen, I know you're sitting there with a lot to share, and Chris as well. So Jim, why don't you come back, and anything else from you, Eileen, or Chris?
Well, I just want to, Ken, they might not have met Christy Heacock, who's here with us. She wrote a beautiful book called Being Human is Hard. Choose Forgiveness. She's has a doctorate in psychology, and she focuses on education and civil discourse. And then Jim Garrison, who is the head of Ubiquity University and started Humanity Rising. So I just want you to know who's coming. And Jim always, and at the beginning of the program, gives a brilliant introduction. And then at the end, and this week so far, he's been talking a lot about yesterday being the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So that's also been with us. Is something we've been talking about. So I'll hand it to you, Jim. And just to say, Ken, as always, my mind just is so blown, and in such a beautiful way when you just help frame what's happening as you always do. And it's just so helpful to see that, yes, so life is in the middle. And when we try to simplify, it does. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, just to close, listening, Ken, and our problems have been around like this for a long time. And one of the things when I was studying the Greeks and Aristotle, for them, of course, human beings have been fighting with each other and not listening to each other, and having problems for all human history, I think. So, but I loved what he said about when we do want to find common ground, when we do want understanding, the Greeks say search for understanding, said two reasons. And one is ignorance, which kind of goes to what you were saying, Ken, about the need for skills. It's not natural. So ignorance, I mean, people really thought slavery was a good idea. Just anything like that. It's often ignorance. They thought following Hitler was a good idea, ignorance. Or stress. And we talked a lot about that. The fear, our fear reaction causes us to do things that where we can't get along, and where we react instead of reason, reactions instead of reason, because we're under stress. So my last word will be from Aristotle, saying for civil discourse, we need to fight ignorance and keep our fear response under control.
Fabulous. Well, actually, a part of what allowed me to come to some of these ideas was Aristotle's book on politics. And so that was a nice gift, and here's a return gift to you. Aristotle's definition of politics is, in quotes, a search for the highest common good. And if you ask what's wrong with that, I think the answer is nothing, except that it doesn't match the politics we actually have. And if we ask why doesn't it do that, Aristotle actually gives us the answer a few pages later when he says, of course, none of this applies to women, children, slaves, or barbarians. By barbarians, he means immigrants. And so we had in Athens a democracy of about 20% of the population. And the question is, what would it take to expand that democracy to the rest of the 80%? And I think the answer is we have to give up the project of domination, because the reason that slaves were not included is because if they were, slavery would end. And the reason women were not included was because if they were, patriarchy would be over. And so the question becomes, rather than trying to exclude people from the process of trying to find the highest common good, what skills do we need in order to expand it? And one of those skills is figuring out how to deal with diversity, how to talk to someone who is different from you. And a part of that consists of what I call, there's a chapter in the book called The Art of Asking Questions. It consists of asking questions that invite people to look at what is true for them and not think that that has to be true for everyone else. Asking questions that do not have a single correct answer. And I think that's a big piece of it. So thank you for that. And thank you, Aristotle, for what you've given us.
And that was really, really rich. And it just strikes me very much when you talk about the 20% and the domination, that that is what we're seeing right now in a lot of ways with this new administration. And it's that same, the patriarchy, the domination and refusal to even to say that there's two genders, for example. Well, you've just wiped out a whole lot of people who don't relate to either of those. So it's a message you don't exist. That is complex, that diversity, trans diversity, that's very, very challenging when you don't even really recognize women and you don't recognize people of color. So I think we're still grappling with that.
Yeah. And what it means is that you have to live a life of pretense. It's back into the closet. And you have to pretend that there's a single standard that applies to everyone. So women are not allowed to do it differently. And that means that you have created a kind of social repression that fuels not only self-deprecation, but the deprecation of others. I think those things go hand in hand with one another. So you have to put other people down because you've suppressed part of yourself. And if you can't be you, why should anyone else be allowed to? And then, of course, there only ends up being one person who's allowed to really be themselves. And that's the one who's at the center of the whole thing. And incidentally, there's a reason for doing that is actually strategic, because if you think about this example from the point of view of gender, what happens to you when you suppress the sort of parts of yourself that don't correspond to this masculine ideal? Not only is there pretense and the wearing of a mask, there's a kind of internal psychic break, which makes it much easier for you to be cruel, to be punishing, to use force and violence against others. And so I think that that's a part of why the military is now being pushed to become a much more violent, patriarchal, sort of ideally masculine entity in preparation for violence.
Good, thank you. I realize we're running into the pressures of time, but I want to just ask the following question of all of you, actually, because I think it, for me, strikes to the kind of the heart of some of the challenges that we're being beset by. Having taught a lot of Greek philosophy, Chris, I completely agree with you on Aristotle. Socrates took the position that it was ignorance that kept us from the higher realms, as it were. But I think, the Jewish tradition is, in my mind, more challenging, particularly around this issue of forgiveness, because the early Jewish seers said it isn't ignorance, it's will. That in fact, people don't do or don't do, not because they know or not know, they know, and they choose to do one thing or another. And that is what accentuates personal responsibility and personal accountability. Because if you don't know, you can't really be accountable. But if you do know, and the entire predicate of law is that people do know, and that in fact they have to be accountable for their actions. And I'm reminded of Eve Ensler's, now called V, if you've read her book, The Apology, and she makes a very powerful point, that as she grappled with the apology her father never made to her, but should have, is that he was in fact accountable, and that the various situations in his life may have contributed, but that there was something deeper that he knew when he molested her. And that's why she called upon him even after he passed to apologize. And I want to add one little note from Yuval Harari's last book, which I just finished reading, called Nexus, which I recommend to everyone listening to this program. It's a brilliant book. Harari's one of the great public intellectuals of our time. He makes the point that we have this notion, again, that people have this worldview because they don't know. He says giving people more facts doesn't change minds, because there's something else operating, and could be a worldview, but there's this kind of mysterious quality of the dark side. Darth Vader did know. The Chancellor did know. Himmler did know. And he still did it. So I just wonder how all of you grapple with this complexity here between ignorance and volition in committing the acts that we commit, because I think upon which of these aspects the preponderance of responsibility falls, that determines to a significant degree the magnitude of the apology and the forgiveness, I would have thought.
I'll comment. I'll jump in on this. It's interesting because something we haven't talked about. So we're talking about sort of this whole our human community, and maybe on some level our fates are bound to each other because we're interconnected. But something that seems very important to me right now is that you're talking about people who know and they do something anyway. And I would say there's a few things here. One is that is again not forgiving what they do, but also still recognizing they are also human being. So the forgiveness is on the human level, and also the forgiveness isn't for them, it's for me. Because if I close my heart to them, I pay the price. So, that I think there's still a great importance here in forgiving. I have something I wrote down because every time I want to tell somebody this, I haven't been able to find it, but today I found it. So I'll say this: revenge, or you can substitute the word of whatever you would say to that person who does it, even though they know better. It's an evil sword. Revenge is an evil sword that wounds the one wielding it. So that's why I forgive that person. And because it would otherwise wound me in a devastating way. And I know that spiritually, I can liberate myself and be skillful, access higher consciousness, access the unified field and oneness, regardless of what anybody else does. I can do that. Well, I suppose now I'm just having a realization that that's what the Bodhisattva is all about. I can do that. I can live in bliss. I already am, actually. I have achieved that. Isn't that interesting? I've never told anybody that, but I feel like I have that inner pathway. But now it's the vow to stay and help others who don't have that. And the Bodhisattva says, and I will keep incarnating until the last one. I haven't taken that vow because I'm not that committed to it. I'm really not, but, so, on some level, I don't care what anybody in Washington, I know two of you are in Washington, and I don't care what they do because it doesn't really diminish who I am in any way, but I do care how it affects other people that I care about. I do care. And it does affect people. To me, any statement from our government that says, or to our society that says, you're not okay the way you are. That's what's important to me. Everybody is fine just the way they are. They're just accepted and loved and perfect as they are. And then I'm very committed to spreading that so that everybody knows that. Whether or not some idiot in Washington can do that because of what you're saying, Jim, they know, but they do anyway. And I just think there's a great power in us. And this is what happens in the after chat, by the way. People come to this place because there is a field. There is a field now being built that's incredible of beings that really know that and hold that energy. And I think that's what there is to do right now. So that's where where I go with that. I won't give my power that I'll see that person, but I won't give them my power.
Yeah.
I just won't.
And
No one's important
just-
enough to make me angry.
Yeah.
and I'll just add too, so many things that I need forgiveness for were because I feel like I didn't know any better, or I thought I was doing the right thing. And we can get into competitive victimhood, or who's really horrible thing. I mean, my horrible thing isn't like other horrible things, that mass murderers or whatever, but I've done things I need forgiveness for. And I've gained wisdom through experience, through tough stuff, through suffering, through all those types of things. So I never feel like in a position to judge, because the human condition is tough. And I don't think we're born knowing a lot of things. I always think we're not born to perform, we're born to learn. They have so much to learn. And again, I don't condone any behaviors. I hate violence. In fact, in psychology, we talk about forgiveness, different types of forgiveness of others, of ourselves, and then of God or fate. Like, I know I've studied a lot of, history is one thing, world history I've taught. And I mean, my gosh, the violence, the horribleness. I mean, it's just crazy what we do to each other. It's awful. Um, and so that's where the forgive, why is it that way? So we kind of have to forgive God, forgive fate for, why is it created that way? And that type of forgiveness. But there is a Maya Angelou quote that I like, and it's, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, then do better. And to me, a lot of the whole purpose of living and that keeps me going is that I can keep learning. And yes, I'm going to mess up, and I'm going to do things I might regret or whatever, and make mistakes, but I can keep learning. I can keep growing, and I'll just do the best I can until I know better. And then I'll try to do better.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's always good to remember Job.
Yeah.
Ken, do you want to make a final comment? And then Tom, why don't you tell us about tomorrow?
Yeah, let's see if I can find this. Well, I'll mention it without reading it to you. I wrote a piece. I think the difficulty with forgiveness is trying to figure out what its limits are. And what do we do in difficult cases? And the most difficult case we're reminded of because of Auschwitz's anniversary is the case of Adolf Hitler. And I wrote a short piece a while ago. I have to see if I can find it, which is called 10 Questions to Ask Before Executing Adolf Hitler. And it's not about whether to execute Adolf Hitler. It's about what happens inside of us when we contemplate doing so, and what are the questions we need to ask before we decide whether we're going to do so or not. Question 1, which is worse, Adolf Hitler or the system of fascism that he created? Question 2, is there any way in which executing Adolf Hitler lets fascism off the hook? And I think the answer to that is yes. And then we have to think about other questions like, what happens to us if we do? Who do we become? I'm writing a piece right now called What is an Enemy? And it's about how we create enemies and who we become as a result of the creation of that enemy. And if we think about it, what fascism consists of is a set of ideas for how to create an enemy. You cannot have fascism without an enemy, an internal enemy and an external one, because hatred is required. But here's the deal with hatred. There is a ground of hatred, and the ground of hatred is caring. Why? Because nobody gets angry over things they don't care about. So it is possible to ask someone who is angry or hating, Why do you care so deeply about this? And you will begin to get an answer that does not come from hatred. There was an event which took place, quite an interesting event, which took place in Switzerland several years ago, in which a group of neo-Nazis were about to march through a town in which there were large numbers of Jewish survivors of the camps. So the question was, how should we approach this? And what they did was really interesting. They created a contest, which was to put a certain amount of money on every step that the neo-Nazis were going to take that would go to a fund to combat fascism. And everybody came out before the march, brought out their little folding chairs, sat on the wayside, and encouraged the neo-Nazis to take more steps so that they would raise more money so that they could then defeat fascism. And the neo-Nazis got about 10 feet before they stopped and realized this isn't working and just left en masse because they were being cheered on for totally the wrong reason and being humiliated. And so Bertolt Brecht said that the great criminals have to be laughed at. And there's some truth in this. But here I think is the real piece about forgiveness. It is a tangible act that we can engage in along the lines of what Martin Luther King Jr. said, whose birthday it was just last week, what he described in terms of how it is that hatred cannot stop hatred. Only love can do that. And I believe that is absolutely brilliant and absolutely true. And I know it is true from my own experience in the civil rights movement working in the South. At the moment when I was challenged and began to experience hatred towards the people who were attacking us, the Ku Klux Klansman who was across the street started to smile because he knew he got me. And I had just lost whatever moral high ground I thought that I had occupied. And I think what forgiveness is it is a way of reclaiming our humanity. It is a way of not only individually for ourselves personally, as Eileen was saying, to take ourselves out of that response and counter response that just escalate tensions and create violence, but also a way of doing that socially. So social forgiveness is what Desmond Tutu did in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And those are the things that I think we have to do. We have to go for the truth. And that means disagreeing with each other, but disagreeing in a context of recognizing that we all care about something. What happens to those people who are hating after the fire in Los Angeles? And the answer is they're showing up just like everybody else to try and help their neighbors, because neighborliness comes first. It is deeper. It is more profound. Love is deeper than hatred. And that's the thing that I think we ultimately rely on. Thank you for that, Jim.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Eileen. Tom, do you want to tee us up for tomorrow?
Yeah, tomorrow we're going to continue to explore this conversation of forgiveness under duress by looking at how do we transmute the sense of hopelessness and pain that many of us are experiencing. So another very rich conversation tomorrow. Delighted that Eileen?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, maybe you were about to, I'm sorry I jumped in, that we're going to have with us Nikki Schmidt, who, you know, Ken, she's quite a a devotee as well of Ken Cloke. And also Nikki did lose her fire in Topanga Canyon. And bringing, and she really also is testament to the next day. She said, Eileen, I lost everything, but I know I'm going to be okay. And I know there's going to be many gifts. And she is walking that path just so beautifully.
Mhm.
So she'll be bringing that forward tomorrow. And all of that she has received is so present to her, the outpouring, the pulling together that Ken's talking about. So it's going to be really wonderful to have her with us tomorrow.
Good. Thank you, Eileen. Anything else, Tom?
No, just a huge thank you to Chris and Ken and Eileen, of course, and Jim for another wonderful day of programming, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation tomorrow.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Tom and Eileen and Christy and Ken. This has been really, really deep and powerful session. Went significantly beyond our normal time, but it's been well worth it. So thank you, all four of you. And so that'll bring us to a close for today. You can join the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you receive the link in your Zoom reminder for today. So this has been day 2 of a 5-day program on the complexities of forgiveness, which is really up for all of us given current world circumstances. So this is a virtue well worth pondering. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you all.